I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast, and I'm joined by my good buddy, the caveman, Eric. And ironically, the caveman is going to be joining the first show of what I hope to be a series of shows about reviews. Now, we're going to do reviews for books and for movies, maybe TV shows, but we're not going to be reviewing every movie that comes out because that would be absurd because almost all of them are never going to be watched by any good Catholic. So, more or books as well. So, more of what we want to look at is books that are recommendable, ones that we recommend people should read or watch, or movies or books that people Catholics are likely to hear about or to read or watch. And so that's kind of the gist of the entire thing. Eric decided to join me for this first one to talk about a series which I think he must have recently read. Did you recently read it, Eric?
Yeah, recently. It was fresh in my mind because it's one of the few fiction books that I actually like.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? I mean, I grew up loving fiction. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, huge Star Wars nerd. I was a big Star Wars nerd as a kid. But I've never read this series, so I'm really interested to hear about it. The first part we're going to do for this entire series, we want to do videos in less than 20 minutes. So we're going to try to be kind of brief as I take a 2-minute introduction. I should shut up and give it right over to you. So, Eric, what are we talking about today?
Yep. So the series we're talking about today is C.S. Lewis, and it's his Space Trilogy. So this was written back in the 30s and 40s, and I think a good place to start is probably the background of why he wrote it. Like you, Kevin, I'm a big Lord of the Rings Tolkien fan, right? So it's kind of interesting that this book was actually written by Lewis as a deal, I guess, with Tolkien. They basically did a toss up and agreed that Lewis would write stories based on space travel, and Tolkien would write stories based on time travel.
Interesting. See, sorry, real quick. I always thought that,
Yeah,
that deal that they made was with Narnia and with Lord of the Rings. I didn't know it was with.
it was actually
Interesting.
the space trilogy. Yeah, yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
okay.
Little known fact. So Lewis, being Lewis, was basically like a bolt of lightning. In today's terms, he was like basically a content producer, right? He just pushed stuff out, and it wasn't perfect. On the other hand, Tolkien was very meticulous and very nitty gritty and perfectionist. So Lewis ended up putting out this trilogy of these 3 books, while Tolkien really never got around to a time travel story, although there's touches of that in, like the Silmarillion and the Second Age and that type of thing. So, well, we
So,
got
so,
half of it.
so the deal was for Tolkien also to do time travel, not
Tolkien,
just a
yep,
fantasy.
Tolkien to do
Interesting.
time travel, and Lewis,
Huh.
and this is in the letters of J.R. Tolkien. If you've read those, Tolkien alludes to this when he's writing one of his letters,
Those are
basically
fantastic.
apologizing. Yes, basically apologizing. I never got around to it, but Lewis did his
Interesting.
thing, type of thing.
If you're a Tolkien fan and you need a perfect book for sitting on the toilet, sorry, excuse the crudeness, but it's perfect because there's these short little letters, and some of them are totally inane and waste of time, but some of them are really fantastic, and you really get the in depth to really get to know Tolkien himself. Really cool.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is why these were written. The first book was written in 1938, and then the second 2 books were in 1943 and 1945. So basically, all 3 books were sort of written in between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings for, again,
Hmm.
for Tolkien nerd reference.
Interesting. And during the war, that's interesting,
Yeah, the last 2 for sure.
right?
So
Interesting.
anyway, that's the background. I can jump into the books to keep us moving along here.
And for anyone, real quick, anyone who doesn't know,
Yeah,
obviously Tolkien and Lewis were part of that. What was the name of their
the
group?
Inklings.
Inklings, yeah, which is pretty cool. And they with a couple other members that were relatively famous, were very good friends. And as you said, kind of challenged themselves and critiqued each other. And it's another letter that I remember reading from Tolkien, apologizing to C.S. Lewis that if he had critiqued one of his books too much, that it was not intended to be insulting. So it really,
Mm-hmm.
really just a very interesting, really interesting
Yep.
friendship.
Yeah. Well, and that friendship comes across in this trilogy, actually, from C.S. Lewis. The protagonist of the first 2 books, and then he's sort of a supporting character in the third, was actually based on Lewis's impression of Tolkien. So the protagonist, his name is Ransom, and he's a philologist, so a studier of languages.
Hmm.
And he's, mild-mannered professor, basically, how Lewis thought of Tolkien, and he's the protagonist, which is kind of cool. And the other cool thing, right? Lewis he never came around to Catholicism, at least that we know of, which is unfortunate. But because, and this is just my opinion, because his protagonist is modeled after Tolkien, I think some of that, the Catholicism shines through, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of in a way
Interesting.
that it doesn't in the Narnia books, in my opinion.
Interesting. Yeah, I went back and reread Narnia as an adult, and I didn't love it. I think for kids, they're a kind of a magical place, but
Mm-hmm.
especially after you read Tolkien, you reread Narnia as a kid, then you read Tolkien, and then you reread Narnia, and it's kind of like whoa. But anyway, not to
Yeah.
critique
No,
Lewis.
no, no, no. So the setting of the books is basically revealed over the course of the book. So I'm not going to get into too much detail in this video, just to keep it mostly spoiler free. But effectively, it's the same universe world that we're in now, right? It's not like Star Wars where it's a galaxy far, far away, sort of alternative universe. It's our current Earth. But the difference is that the planets of our solar system have life on them, and they're different species of humanoids on them. Humanoid here kind of defined as, like us having a body and immortal soul.
Mm-hmm.
The different planets are in different stages of life. So, like Jupiter, Saturn, the gas giants, they're all already extinct, basically, right? There's no life on them anymore. Mars is a very well-established civilization that's kind of reaching the end of its lifetime. Earth is like our current Earth, and then Venus is actually, and we'll get more into that when we get into the second book, but very young, sort of Garden of Eden style at that age. So very interesting. It's very
Does he talk about Pluto at all?
no. Like I think everything past Saturn he just kind of references, and he doesn't talk about Mercury, but Pluto isn't a planet, Kevin. Come on. No, but it's a very Christian Catholic setting. Each of the planets is ruled over by what he calls an Oyarsa, which is a allegory, or even very thinly disguised as an actual angel, right? Or I guess a power or dominion or whatever the class of angel would be that kind of controls the planet, moves the planet. And then of course God exists, even though on the other planets he's given a different name, but it's still the same God, which is kind of cool. Cool setting for a science fiction book.
Yeah, I mean better than most, right? I mean, I don't think most would have any mention whatsoever of God, or at least if they do, something kind of crazy. So that's a plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's good. So unlike Lord of the Rings, keep going back to Lord of the Rings. Really, Lord of the Rings is like one book, and it's split into 3 volumes, right? It's basically just to keep it from being a 1,000-page book. These 3 books in the Space Trilogy are very much each their own book.
Mm-hmm.
They're each unique. They each have their own story, sort of their own arc and their own points that are made. So I think
And
I can
are these?
probably
Sorry, real quick. Are these like Tolkien-esque, where they're hard to get into? They're long. They're not
no.
dry, but Tolkien-y, or they're more like C.S. Lewis, where they're much more simple, I
Yes.
suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. So like, here's the first one. It's actually
Okay.
quite
Mm-hmm.
small. What is it? Looks like it's about 150 pages or so. But yeah, probably pretty quick read there. Second one's just slightly bigger, and then the third one is kind of a monster. It's as big as both
Mm-hmm.
of the other 2 combined.
Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, do you want me to dive into like high level, non spoiler sort of takeaways from them, or any
Yeah,
other?
it's interesting. I see a couple of your notes. You say setting is obviously allegorical. That's pretty interesting. So yeah. So there are 3 books. I mean, I guess if you want to do a brief summary of each one, that would probably be good.
Sure. Yeah. So the first book is called Out of the Silent Planet. The silent planet being Earth, and out of meaning basically traveling away from it. And without getting into spoilers, it's very much an adventure story, which takes place, the majority of which takes place on Mars. And it's like, I guess if we're with, again, trying not to give spoilers, a sort of major theme, major takeaway of the first book is really kind of going back to Tolkien and his heroes philology, is the importance of language of society, and specifically how corruption of language actually can corrupt the people and can corrupt the society.
It sounds familiar.
Very
Pretty
familiar.
interesting.
In our second video, I think I'll get into some more spoilerific details of how that looks and what that means. But yeah, no, it's super, super applicable to today. When you read through some of the points he's making, it's hard to believe that it was written, 85 years ago.
Well, it's pretty incredible, because if you read 1984 or Brave New World, which I don't even recommend anybody does, but if you do, it written in similar times, and you can see they really even then they could tell the big movement, because I think you'd had such a change in 50 years in terms of speech and how it was, propagated, how it was literally spread. I mean, from TV and radio and stuff. And I think that was pretty shocking to a lot of these men who saw what was going to happen, what was going to come from that change in how you actually spread information.
Well, and that would be an interesting podcast on its own for dystopian nerds, 1984 versus Brave New World.
I
can't really recommend. There's
no, I kind of hate both of them, but there's value in both of them too.
I'd say Huxley was right. Huxley won, right? The subjugation of people happens through ease and laziness and pleasure rather than brute force. We can see that in our current world. He was definitely right on that. But
true. Yep.
Anyway, off topic.
Next show.
Next show.
It's a good one.
So yeah, without spoilers, that's kind of the main theme of the first book, Mars, and like really the major point and takeaway is, the evils of the corruption of language and how important we have to guard language to keep it from corrupting not only, the words we use, but the meanings and the thinking that we use behind those words.
Interesting. Good topic. Okay, interesting. So what about book number 2?
Book number 2 is called Perelandra. Perelandra being the name of the planet Venus in this series. So while the first one was on Mars, the second one's on Venus. Still, Ransom is the protagonist, the J.R.R. Tolkien-like guy. And again, it's a very adventure-y book, and there's even some action in it, but it's a lot more dialogue-driven, right? So while the first book, you could, maybe almost Narnia-ish, where it's, we're going through this adventure and all these things happen. The second book starts out that way and then quickly becomes almost what I would describe as an apologetics course debate for the majority of the book.
Okay.
So a lot more dialogue driven. And again, without going into spoilers, we can get into those later. The major point of the book is very much the powerlessness that we all possess as people, right? We can't control what goes on in the world, particularly when we're fighting, basically the devil or Satan, who's much more powerful in everything than we are. What we're not asked to control that. We're asked to control what we do, right? It's sort of the major, I guess, the climax of the book is the hero realizing, I can't win out here. What I can do is win interiorly, right? By being the best person I can be, by aligning my will to God's will. And then that way is the way to actually improve the world. It's sort of, instead of looking outward, looking inward. And in Lewis's style, it's just a very beautifully, I don't even know what to call it, but very, very beautifully written. And it's not ham-fisted, but it's also very clear what he's trying to say.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine something like that being written recently, right? I mean, just because everything there's so much of a, I don't know, wariness of trying to even mention God or anything. I think people are kind of afraid of it. To actually have a basic morality, a basic godliness in a science fiction book is, it sounds like absolute insanity. It sounds really interesting. I'm very intrigued. Okay, so how about book number 3?
Yep, book number 3, again, is longer than the other 2 books combined, and it's much less of an adventure story. It's more of a dystopia. So, you mentioned 1984 and A Brave New World. This fits much better in with that kind of a storytelling. than a Narnia adventure story. And the major takeaway of this one, it mostly takes place on Earth, is that we're validated, and it's a very Chestertonian point, but we're validated on the truth and what we know to be the truth, based on what evil can't deal with, can't stand. So it's not directly referenced in the book. It actually is Christianity, not Catholicism. But a good example of this is Vatican II, right? They are okay with every other religion. It's okay if you're a Mormon. It's okay if you're a Muslim. It's okay if you're blah, blah, blah. The one thing they don't abide is traditionalism, right?
True.
And so very much like that, the book kind of comes to that conclusion where the protagonist, which is not actually the same one from the first two books, he's sort of a supporting character, but the protagonist isn't Christian or Catholic. But as he kind of goes through this dystopia, this story, he realizes this is what these guys can't stand. There must be something to it. Maybe this is where I need to be looking.
Interesting. So it sounds like all three books are pretty good, I don't know, glimpse at something, at kind of where we are, or things that we can learn in our own times.
Yeah, no, they're all very, like I said, if I were reading it now, I wouldn't be surprised if, a traditional Catholic fiction writer of today were actually writing them to tell these same points.
Wow.
which is really kind of striking, right? For books that were all written really before the end of World War II.
Well, it's amazing because we always think that our times are the worst and the hardest and the most unique, and everything's been seen already under the sun. I mean, maybe some of it, I guess some of it's new because of technology and stuff, but the actual issues with man as a whole, they've all happened several times before that. And it is really interesting. And like you said, like when you read these, like 1984, these dystopian books, it does give you kind of a glimpse that they saw what was coming, or already what they thought was, and they may have thought it's going to happen in the next 10 years. It's a good lesson to us, that nowadays, like, oh yeah, the world's going to end in 10 years. Like, yeah, sure. C.S. Lewis probably said the same thing, right? I mean, something of the sort. And so that's a learning experience. And so go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we've got like 2.5 minutes left if we're keeping to your 20-minute guideline here. So I was going to go into, basically the recommendations, and I do recommend them. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not a fiction guy, but I still enjoyed them. And maybe that's why I enjoyed them, honestly, right? They're not escapist fantasies that take you out of the real world. They're actually just, adventure stories, at least the first two, that are applicable to today's world, and basically have points that you can take away and kind of enlightening. Doesn't really read like fiction.
Interesting.
At least progressively as the books go on. The first one starts a little bit more, and then by the third one, you're like,
sounds like us.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the best type of book, right? I mean, I think the best kind of escapism in a way is when it's kind of realistic, right? It's kind of like, wow, I can put myself in the shoes of what's going on, rather than too much craziness up in the stars and flying spaceships and
lightsabers,
and lightsabers. I mean, again, I'm still
which
a pretty
I like.
big Star Wars guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Not as much as I used to be. They've kind of been ruined for me a bit recently. But no, that's really interesting. That's good to know, because it's so hard to find books, fantasy books or sci-fi books, that you can rely on and trust and say, hey, I can read this and not feel kind of icky about it. It's I guess kind of still a guilty pleasure book. You're not reading the catechism or something, but
but you can't do that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. You can feel good that, hey, this is a book that I can feel good about reading, and it's coming from a good Christian author. So that's really good to know. And I'm curious to hear the more philosophical points in our part 2, which we'll obviously publish soon.
And before we get out of part 1, I also did want to mention, this is the Catholic Family Podcast. Each of the books, from an age appropriateness perspective, each of the books, like kind of the overarching theme of all three, is really original sin and the fall of man. So each of the books deal with themes, whether briefly or in depth, that are sort of adult in nature. Nothing explicit, not quite as, 1984 or Brave New World levels. But it is something that I'd probably recommend for adults and mature teens, right? This isn't a series that you want to read your kids before they go to bed. And then in addition to that, there's also some frightening moments, some depictions
Well, it's
of demonic
frightening.
possession, for
2
example.
seconds, and now.